Hello everybody, welcome back to Espresso with the Evangelist. Today I'm here with Dave Murphy. Hi Dave.
Hello Dave.
And Lizzie Erdley.
Hello Dave.
Great, so this is the second in a series. We're doing 3 videos about foundations for experiments, right?
Yes.
And in the first one we started off with forming a hypothesis, right? And so Dave, why don't you recap for us really quick, sort of what's our use case, what was our hypothesis?
So in our scenario, we have a set of hotels and we're doing an experiment to determine whether or not checking the spa package by default increases, we started out
with a couple
whether,
ideas, didn't we?
We had a couple ideas. We started out with whether or not that would increase satisfaction because we were getting great satisfaction scores back from people who had the spa package. But we realized that would be a difficult metric to measure. So really, ultimately for the business, the important thing to understand is whether the booking revenue per user is going to go up as a result of pre-selecting the spa package. Now, one of the things we also did to mitigate some of the risk that you thought about in the last package of doing this across all of our customers is we're going to target our high-value customers who are willing to spend more with us.
Right. So our hypothesis was because we see higher satisfaction from people that get the spa package, we are going to pre-check the spa package for our platinum customers, and our expectation is that we're going to see greater revenue from that, and we're not going to hurt the business as we do it.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Cool. All right. So then I guess we better talk about sort of what's a key metric and go into that a little bit, and then maybe Lizzie, you can tell us a little bit about sort of in general what are good ways to choose your metrics. Yeah.
Yeah. So the key metric we determined was going to be the average booking per user. So that's the one that we're going to look at as
that's the needle we're trying to move.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So Lizzie, what makes up a good metric?
Yeah, I think I've got a bit of a checklist of 4 things, which is an ideal metric in my opinion. So that would be, the metric's got to be meaningful. So it's got to be really measuring something which is meaningful to your business. So don't measure, a number of clicks on the page if what you're really trying to increase is bookings or revenue. The next one is it's got to be directional. So you need to know if the metric increases or it decreases. You need to be able to know instantly whether that's a good or a bad thing. So an example of a not very directional metric would be, say, revenue per booking, because it could be that you have decreased the number of bookings. So this metric goes up, but it's actually pretty bad for your business. The third one would be that it's sensitive. So you want one that is going to be able to change in enough time for you to be able to actually get significance on this metric in a reasonable amount of time. And then the final one is that it should be fit for the test that you're going to apply to it. So it needs to satisfy all of the statistical assumptions of the t-test or whatever statistical test you're going to use.
Okay, and we'll come back to some of that actually when we talk about cautions and stuff down the road here.
Yep.
So I think one thing would be good to talk about here is we talk about our key metric, right? So we should take a second and talk about what are the other sort of, whether you call them organization metrics or guardrail metrics, what else should we be keeping an eye on as we run the experiment?
Well, certainly we'd want to make sure that our users are, that we get overall our revenue goes up. And that could be not just booking revenue, it could be other revenue that we get from users, and we're not negatively impacting that. We want to make sure that the implementation doesn't cause a performance problem on the page.
Right.
We want to make sure that users don't abandon as soon as they see a higher price. There's a whole variety of things that we may want to measure across our company that we may or may not understand ahead of time is impacted by this experiment we're running. But if we have some unintended consequence or some unintended benefit, we want to be able to identify that as part of measuring what's happening.
I think it's super important to point out that these other metrics really aren't specific to this experiment. They're things we want to watch all the time. Mm-hmm. So when you're saying, I'm going to run this experiment, I have to create a ton of instrumentation. No, you should be figuring out how to always know whether you're having slow pages, always know whether you're having abandonment, always know, and you probably have metrics, people have metrics for this stuff somewhere, right? So the guardrail or organizational metrics are sort of, in a sense, always on. You're always watching those. And then I think what we're talking about today, Lizzie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the metric about, so we should talk about feature metrics. So we're making this change to this feature, which is we're toggling this button on, or this checkbox on. The feature metric is specific to if someone were to uncheck that box, for instance, as they go through this flow, that's a feature-specific metric. Am I right here?
Feature-specific metrics are ones that you're particularly interested in this change that you're making, and they're usually very useful for getting more insights into how your change has affected user behavior or something very specific to the particular change you're making, but aren't necessarily relevant for all the experiments that you run.
Right. So you sort of have your organizational or guardrail metrics, and then you have your feature-specific metrics, and then we have we have our key metric here, which is that we want that revenue per user to go skyward.
Exactly. So there are some things, though, that we need to watch out for when we create these metrics. Lizzie, maybe some of the things that are cautions that you might bring up when people set up metrics.
Sure, probably the biggest caution is not to measure too many things, because it does impact your chance of getting a false positive. Or it's definitely good to measure as much as you can, but to be aware of the impact of the false positive rate that it has. So if you measure 20 metrics, for example, and you use a 5% false positive rate on each of those, then you have 20 times that 5% chance of getting a false positive. So you're much more likely to see something incorrect if you look at many things.
So you basically need to be aware of that. It's good to measure a lot of things, but you need to be aware of the things that might happen as a result of that, or the things you need to be mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say if you see something which is really unexpected, probably the safest thing to do is to rerun the test and see if you see it again. So you'd create a new hypothesis where this unexpected change is now your key metric, and then you'd retest.
Yeah, it's get up that random thing, right? So I guess the thing is, if we talk about feature versus organizational, you may have a bunch of organizational metrics, and one of them may flash some kind of a good or bad sign. That's less of an issue in terms of you may want a bunch of those, but if your feature metrics, if you decided, for this experiment, I'm gonna watch 10 things, or I'm gonna watch 20 things, you need to refocus your hypothesis, right? Figure out what's the key metric you're really gonna focus on, because if you got 20 things that you're looking at just for this feature, random luck says that one of them is going to come through and either say something's great or awful, right?
Yeah, it also makes it a lot harder to interpret whether this was good or bad. Maybe some things go up, some things go down. If you test so many things, it's really hard to make a decision out of it.
Great. So you need to basically understand which are the things that you care about and you think are really being impacted.
So one of the things to think about, we were talking about limiting our experiment just to the platinum users, right? But there's another way to attack this, to figure out whether it affects the platinum versus the basic differently. Yeah?
Sure. And if you either believe that this is a valuable enough experiment to take some revenue loss because there's something that you really want to learn across all your entire user base, or if you don't really think that there's going to be much of a risk at all in terms of revenue loss, you think that, I realistically believe that across all the user base we'll see a revenue increase, then you might want to experiment across all of your users. Now the question becomes, how might you want to target them? Do you want to just look at all users as one single cohort, or do you want to target them a little differently? Lizzie, what do you think?
Well, one of the benefits of doing it, targeting it per cohort, so it's kind of like doing a separate experiment for each cohort, is that you can be more confident that you will get very close to your intended distribution of users into each of the two treatments, into A or B. Whereas if you were to do it after the fact, it's still probably fine in most cases, but it's just a little less precise on the distribution.
Right. So if I target and I say, I'm going to send half the platinum this way and half the platinum that way, and I'm going to send half the basic this way and half the basic that way, I know I'm going to almost certainly get a very close to a 50-50 for each of those groups. If I split everybody, there's a chance that I might have more platinums just by random luck go one way versus another. Mm-hmm. But we'd know that anyway, right? We'd be able to see that in the stats when we're...
Yeah, exactly. And the benefit of doing that is that when you look at your metric and then you use what we call a property to identify whether or not it's a platinum user or a standard user, mm-hmm. you can see if that platinum user distribution is close to 50-50, and if it's close to 50-50, you might want to say, okay, I'm going to use this metric and the results of this metric as part of my analysis. The other benefit is not only can you look at your platinum users and your standard users, but you can look at the population as a whole.
Right, so sort of three items on your dashboard, effectively.
Exactly. So right. You can kind of look and see what your risk of analysis is, and you can look at it as a whole as well to see if the result came in. And doing properties as part of your event, so you've got your booking event, allows you to slice and dice your data in a variety of different ways, giving right. you a 360-degree view of the challenge. For example, another property might be, is this a high-end hotel property, a mid-tier hotel property, or a low-end hotel property across all of my properties? Right. And see what happens in each of those subpopulations.
All right, so we'll be able to do a slice and dice kind of as the flow is coming through, as opposed to putting them in separate buckets on the way in.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. So that's sort of targeting versus event property. Right. Awesome. Okay, so that's a good point to cover. I think we could probably wrap for today. You know, our goal was we refreshed on the hypothesis. We talked about how to choose your metrics. We talked about choosing a key metric. We talked about
which in this case was average revenue per user.
We talked about feature metrics, like for this experiment, we probably want to figure how many people uncheck the box, right? And then we talked about guardrail or organizational metrics, things we want to watch all the time, like page response time, abandonment rate, you know, whether you call those engineering metrics or what, right? So we covered kind of different kinds of metrics. And then we looked at how we could achieve ending up with metrics. We could either create different cohorts with targeting, or we could use event properties to kind of slice them up as they come through. And that leaves us set up for the next video, which is about the effect of the number of users,
right.
Power. A lot of users get you an outcome quicker, fewer users takes more time. And we'll cover that in the third video. So I think we covered a lot of ground. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave.
Take care, Lizzie.
Lizzie.